Okay, so we've got our waistband here. We're going to start sewing this on now, and you'll see, as we mentioned before, there are notches. There are 3 notches along the way. This is one side seam notch. This is a center front notch, and this is a side seam notch as well. And then we have our extension, which is the extension that goes underneath the back of the waistband. So just to get us started, before we start sewing it on, we just want to press the waistband in half. So literally just putting the raw edges together. So we've got our skirt, it's still inside out the way that was when we pressed the hem and the side seams before. And what's important when you start sewing this is that you get this extension on the right side of the garment. So you can see this line, that notch there will match up with this, and then that's your little extension, and then you'll come around to the other side here and that will line up with that there, and then this extension goes under, and the buttonhole goes on top and the button goes on the extension. So we press this in half, so we'll, for our future reference, we know for when we turn it back. So what we're doing here is we're going to line up the notch with the tape there. We're going to stitch it on. There's a 1 centimeter seam allowance around this waist. So we'll just do a few stitches to get started. And what we're going to do is we're going to match these up. So we've got a notch there, and we're going to match that up with a side seam here. So match that up perfectly. Again, you can't just like start sewing and then sew and sew and sew all the way to the end, because it's never going to line up properly. You will find that because this goes slightly onto the bias from the shape of the waist here, and this is on the straight grain, that you probably will have to get in between the 2 layers and push that fabric in a little bit, so that it's easing up slightly underneath. And also to keep an eye on what your darts are doing. We've already pressed them the right way, but just make sure that they're not folding back on themselves as you go around. So again, we have our center front notch on and you'll see how that's slightly longer, and that's why you have to sort of ease the skirt into the waistband a little bit. So I'm going to line that up there. Just put a pin in. Oops. So we're working section by section. We're not trying to do the whole thing in one go. And as you go along too, like you can have a look and see mine's all actually quite flat there, so I haven't created any pleats or any tucks along the way. Because I think if I did find one, I'd go back and fix it now rather than waiting till the end. Okay, so again we have another notch which will line up with the side seam here. So take your time when you're doing this, don't try and rush through it. Slow and steady wins the race. And make sure when you get to the end too that you've got a whole centimetre of the seam of the waistband going past the folded edge here. Because if you match up, like if you match them up like this, the raw edge with the fold, then you've actually got no seam allowance to finish the end of the waistband. Okay, so then once you've stitched it on, have a look. You can see that it is slightly eased because the waist was bigger, slightly bigger than the waistband. Just check that all the way around. Cool. And now we'll go to the iron, and we'll just give this a press as well to press that seam allowance up into the waistband. So we're at the ironing board. I've turned the skirt the right way out, and I've tried to make this top section as flat as I can to get in to press the waistband. So we're pressing the seam allowance up into the waistband. And you can see, because of the calico as well, like, you know, if the seam allowance was going down, you'd see it, so you can actually keep an eye on it as you go along, which is handy. So that's all been pressed up, and you can see that easing has sort of shrunk into the waistband, which is good. And now we're going to, on the inside, we'll be folding this down, and we'll be stitching through here. It's a stitch called a ditch stitch, and that'll secure the inside. But because we've just got a raw edge here, we want to finish that off with something a bit nicer, and that's why we're going to do a Hong Kong bind on that edge there. So we've got our bind here. It's a very fun florally bind we're going to put on the inside, and it really is like a lot of garments, certainly a lot of menswear. You know, our feature of the garment would be that, you know, they'd use this for the bind inside the waistband, and they might also use it for the pocket bags or something as well. So it's, you know, something to be quite conservative on the outside, but, you know, a little bit more fun and silly on the inside. So what we're going to do here, we want to join these together, but because they're bias pieces, if we join them, like if we just do that and then sew it together, that seam, you know, can stretch because that's where the bias is. So when you're wanting to sew two pieces of bias together, you cross them over so you get a right angle here, and then you sew from one corner here down to the other corner, so the stitch line will actually be on the straight grain. You can see there. So then the join it's on the straight grain, but when you fold it back, it's on an angle. And then we just need to trim this away. So we'll just trim it back to 1 centimeter. And then you could also press that open, but I think I'll just sort of give it a bit of a hand press as I go along. And this is also a little bit wide too, because of the technique that we're using. This probably could be, you know, like a 2 centimeter wide bias. It's still going to work, but it'll just mean that there'll be a bit more bulk, you know, inside the waistband. So this is the extension here, and the extension, that's going to be folded back and bagged out. So, you know, when it's finished, it will actually look, you know, like this, with that edge tucked under as well. So we only want the bind to start at this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip that in, because we have a centimeter seam allowance there, so I'm going to clip it in, that's about 6 or 7 mil. And then we'll start stitching our bind on here. Now the bind can go, I'm going to take it a little bit past that. We'll start the stitching here, but the bind will actually stick out a bit more. Just make sure that when you've got this, I should have turned this back around the other way, but make sure that you don't have any bits of the garment coming up, and you'll end up sewing the side seam into the waistband or something. And just check as you go along that nothing's where it shouldn't be. So I'm just sewing this on at 6mm. So here's our join. So what we're going to do here is just going to give that a bit of a finger press open. And then we're going to take it all the way to the end of this extension. So now I can cut that back. So what's going to happen now is, actually you can see there, the extension there. Oops. I'm just going to clip that in a tiny bit there. Okay, so the idea now is that I'm going to give this a press. Okay, so we have a bind here, and I've see how I pressed that under. So literally stitched it on at 6mm, pressed it down, then folded it again and pressed it under. So it's a really cute finish there. Now what I'm going to do, because we need this to be secured at the back, and it's really, I mean, that's it, that's the back width that we ended up with, so it's really not, we don't really have to trim that back or anything, that's fine, that width. So what we want to do now is to hold this back bit in place. So we're going to ditch stitch. So just put the needle right down. So we want to follow along here. So I'll do a little bit and then I'll show you. So it's obviously very, very obvious in with the black thread, but if you had a matching thread, and I've started off nice and slowly, I've got a little bit wide there, but it really should be right just next to the fold.